text, how do you explain all the killing that happened in the Old Testament?
Yeah, it's a struggle that some Christians have. When you read through the Old Testament, you do see that it records a lot of war and a lot of killing. I'm going to give two explanations which will answer 95% of those wars, at least explain them. But before I do, let me start with an analogy to help us through it. Try to imagine two kingdoms with two kings. One kingdom, the king allows everyone to do anything they want. It's complete lawlessness. If you want to rape, you could rape. If you want to kill, you can kill. If you want to pillage, you can pillage. If you want to have slaves, you can have slaves. That kingdom allows everything. The other kingdom, you have a king who's a just king and who punishes unrighteousness. This king believes in laws and order and punishes injustice. Which king is more loving? Which society is better? Obviously, the king who believes in justice. So as we're going through this now, try to keep in mind that there is such a thing as lawlessness and there's just such a thing as justice. Now, how do we explain all these killings? All these wars, shall we say, in the Old Testament? I'm going to read from Deuteronomy chapter 9, and I'm starting with verse 4. When the Lord your God drives them out before you, do not say to yourself, the Lord brought me in to take possession of this land because of my righteousness. Instead, the Lord will drive out these nations before you because of their wickedness. You are not going to take possession of their land because of your righteousness or your integrity. Instead, the Lord your God will drive out these nations before you because of their wickedness in order to keep the promise he swore to your fathers. So, if you actually look at the wars in the Old Testament, they were not random. They were not ethnic cleansing, as some say. This was God bringing judgment upon a society. We see this with Sodom and Gomorrah. He sends Abraham. Abraham couldn't even find 10 righteous in that land. And it works both ways. God doesn't show favoritism. When Jerusalem was in sin and would not repent, and lawlessness was happening, child sacrifice to idols, all kinds of injustice, God brought Babylon in to judge Jerusalem. The Joshua wars, this is where the wars are mandated by God to take possession of the land. He gave the Canaanites, particularly the Amorites, 430 years to repent and do the right thing and have a just society, and they did not. So when the atheists paint this picture of the Old Testament, they try to paint a picture of this strong nation oppressing a weak nation, but it's nothing like that. It's more like police invading a drug trafficking organization and bringing judgment upon it, because every one of these nations, it's pretty clear through the scriptures that adultery, incest, slavery, child sacrifice, bestiality, homosexuality, all these were rampant. Now, that begs the question then, of course, would a loving God allow evil to go unpunished? And of course, the answer for me is no. There's an example in the Old Testament of Nineveh, where God sends Jonah, gave them an opportunity to repent, said if you don't repent, judgment will come upon you. And of course, they repented, and God let them go on living in a good society. Now, another example is when Israel wanted to fight with Moab. God said, no, you cannot fight with Moab or Ammon, I believe it was in Deuteronomy chapter 2. God refused to go let them fight a random fight. So unlike the Near East, God prohibited a lot of wars. Now, here's another thing about these wars is that while in the Near East, during that time, when an army would go in to take another nation, they would rape, they would pillage, they would take slaves, and God did prohibit this. So very, very different from the way the atheists try to paint the picture. Now, one more point I want to make is that the killings and the wars of the Old Testament are not always approved. We know in Judges, it records I believe it's Judges chapter 19, records the rape and the murder of a Levite concubine. If you actually read through the text, it is not God or the Bible doesn't approve of that act. So it's basically recording history, and you can see that with many of these wars. So not always approved by the Bible, often it's recording history. And if you actually look, most of these wars were one generation during Joshua's rule, where God said, go in and bring judgment upon this nation and take the land. And one more point I want to make, Eric, it's important to understand that fighting in order to survive in the Near East was a way of life. That's the way things happened. That's the way you acquired land. That's the way those cultures actually lived. Okay, does that help answer the question?
It does.
Okay.
So then, with all these wars that were recorded in the Old Testament, how do you distinguish those wars from the Muslim jihad?
Yeah, good question. And there's a big distinction, and here's what they are. Generally, they were geographically limited. Jihad is not. Jihad wants to take the entire world. They're limited to one generation, primarily Joshua's. If you actually look at the wars of David, many of them, almost all of them, were defensive wars. They're designed to punish corrupt cultures. The jihad wars, if you don't convert, you can die. The wars were with military combatants, with the exception of Jericho and Ai, but it's believed those were military installations. So they were with military combatants. It wasn't going and killing, innocent children and innocent women. So very, very big distinction there. It was one generation. It was to bring judgment upon those nations, and it was very, very limited. So it's not this culture embedded in the Old Testament. Rather, it was done for a specific purpose or at a specific time.